I used to think I would die in that cabin. Not from the cold, not from hunger, but because, for the first time, I had to face myself. From the living room window, Evan could see the skyline cut sharply by silent glass buildings, cold and indifferent, just like his mood these past few days. Denver in February wasn't a bad place to live. Snow blanketed the steps. Wind slithered through every crevice, and cafes stayed lit late into the night. But the more he looked, the more Evan felt like a speck of dust trapped behind the glass of someone else's life. There were no cracks to escape through, but also no space left to breathe. His life, if it could still be called that, was a sequence of repetitive tasks, like lines of code, waking up with no idea why he should, staring at the screen through bloodshot eyes, and forcing a smile in meetings where people turn on their cameras but not their hearts. The bright designs, the vivid color palettes he produced day after day, tidy, polished, no longer contained any piece of him. He didn't draw to express anything. He worked to get it done, to make the deadline, to adjust the feedback, to have something to live on. On the outside, people might think he was doing fine. A decent-looking apartment, a creative freelance job, a sweet girlfriend, and a few LinkedIn posts that got a couple hundred likes. But inside, Evan knew the truth. Everything had rotted a long time ago. There wasn't a specific moment that broke him. No sudden shock, no devastating loss. It was the monotony, the quiet slipping away, that proved most brutal, as if he had died a long time ago, but his body just hadn't gotten the message yet. And then it came. Breakup text with barely a sentence. A layoff email citing company restructuring. A freezing afternoon when he realized he hadn't eaten in over 30 hours. Not because he was saving money, but because he simply hadn't felt hungry. When the email notification pinged again, he laughed. A short, dry laugh that vanished the moment it appeared. He shut the laptop, stood up, walked to the bathroom, and stared into the mirror. A gaunt face, messy hair, hollow eyes. Nothing in that man's reflection resembled the boy who once dreamed of becoming an oil painter. That boy had been quietly replaced by a functioning adult. The thought of going somewhere came like a hairline crack, subtle at first, just a quiet urge to escape, without needing to know the destination. But day by day it grew until it consumed him entirely. Not to rest, but to disappear. No one looking, no one asking, no need for goodbyes. The thought of going somewhere came like a hairline crack, subtle at first, just a quiet urge to escape, without needing to know the destination. But day by day it grew until it consumed him entirely. Not to rest, but to disappear. No one looking, no one asking, no need for goodbyes. He began searching for places as obscure as possible. Spots with phrases like no signal, no internet, no reviews. That was his first and only requirement. Eventually, he stopped at a short listing for an old cabin deep in the Colorado woods. Just a fireplace, no electricity, no running water, no people. Instead of fear, Evan felt an eerie sense of relief. He didn't rush to pack. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if preparing for a ritual, not a vacation, not a getaway, a journey to surrender. He couldn't quite name what he was letting go of, but deep down he knew something inside him was waiting either to be buried or unearthed. The next morning, he left the city before the sun had risen. The car carried him away from the cold buildings, the honking horns, and the version of himself he'd been performing for far too long. Evan didn't know how long he'd be gone. He wasn't even sure if he'd return. He only knew one thing. If he stayed in the hollow version of himself, he would vanish, even while breathing. Evan didn't leave the city in search of peace. He left because he knew if he stayed even one more day, he would unravel into thin, crumbling layers, like early spring snow melting off a glass roof, leaving no trace that had ever truly been there. The car carried him through familiar streets, past billboards he had once designed, past the corner where he and his ex-girlfriend had held hands last winter. He didn't look back, not because he felt nothing, but because he knew some sorrows, if looked at directly, will root you to the spot. As the city faded behind the fogged-up windows, mountains began to rise ahead, looming like blue-gray ghosts. Snow fell gently. No one spoke. No music played. Just the hum of the engine blending with the distant whisper of wind, as if the world itself were making room for someone who had chosen silence. The snow had grown heavier by the time Evan stopped in front of the weathered wooden door. His hands trembled, not entirely from the cold, but from the strange sense that he was about to cross into a different world, not just far from the city, but far from the version of himself he'd carried for too long. The door creaked under his push, as if protesting something he couldn't yet name. The cabin was small, a single room, thick wooden walls soaked with the scent of mold, a patchy gray tile floor. There was nothing inside except a tiny fireplace, a cracked wooden table, and a few logs strewn carelessly in the corner. No electricity, no running water, no mirrors, nothing to reflect him back, and strangely, that made it easier to breathe. Evan closed the door behind him. For a moment, the wind vanished. No sounds, no car horns, no voices, only silence, thick and ancient, like dust that hadn't been swept in decades. He stood there, backpack still slung over his shoulder, staring into the empty room as if he'd walked into a dream he wasn't sure was nightmare or sanctuary. Slowly, he took off his gloves and bent down to pick up a piece of firewood, hands still trembling. He lit the fire, each movement deliberate, like performing an ancient rite. The flames caught, soft orange light flickering across the darkened walls, casting a glow into the corners of his eyes where too many sleepless nights had left their mark. He didn't sit right away, just stood there, palms near the fire, as if waiting for some forgotten version of himself to emerge from the warmth. No alarm clocks, no meeting invites, no deadlines, and no one left asking, "How have you been?" in an old message he'd never replied to. Then he set down the backpack and lowered himself to the floor beside the fireplace. One hand rested on his chest. From deep within, a feeling began to rise, not fear, not relief, something stranger, like stepping into a house you once called home, long abandoned, now draped in silence. And then, rising quietly his mind, as gentle as breath and solid as stone, came a single question. If there's nothing left to prove you're alive, then who are you? Evan woke to light, a white so pure it felt unreal, spilling through cracks of the cabin door. At first, he thought it must be late in the day, but the moment his hand touched the air, he felt it, a cold sharper than the day before. He jolted upright, stepped toward the door, cracked it open and froze. Evan woke to light, a white so pure it felt unreal, spilling through cracks of the cabin door. At first, he thought it must be late in the day, but the moment his hand touched the air, he felt it, a cold sharper than the day before. He jolted upright, stepped toward the door, cracked it open and froze. Snow had fallen all night, bearing every trace of existence. No paths, no forest trails, no direction. Everything was blank, devoid of anchor, an endless stretch of white, silent and indifferent, as if the world had been erased and redrawn in cold ash. He stepped back, shut the door. For the first time since arriving, a heavy pressure crashed into his chest. Not from the cold, but from the realization. He was trapped. He reached for his bag, pulled out his phone. No signal. The screen glowed faintly, a blurred light. At the top, the words "no service" sat plainly, but they landed like a sentence handed down. He paced across the cabin, held the phone up, toggled airplane mode on and off. Nothing. No reply from the world. The panic didn't strike like a wave. It crept in like fog, thin and inescapable. His hands grew numb. Not from the weather, but because his body had begun to understand the way a wild animal does. There's no way out. He opened his backpack and counted 6 protein bars, 1 small bottle of water, no stove, no water source, not enough firewood to last more than 2 nights. This cabin wasn't made to be lived in. It was a shelter for lost hikers. And now he was one, a man in his 30s, standing silent in a box of cold wood, with eyes that no longer held certainty about who he was or whether he even deserved to be rescued. He picked up the notebook he'd opened the night before, but today his hands couldn't write. They trembled, not from the cold, but from the knowing if he wrote it down, it would become real. And then he cried. No sobbing, no scream, just silent tears carving down his cheeks. He turned his face away, as if even he couldn't bear to see himself cry, like a child locked in a classroom, holding back tears so the other kids wouldn't laugh. But now, there was no one left to hide from. No friends, no parents, no one calling him home. The world outside might have already forgotten he existed. No one knew where he was. And then a question came, not in words, but with the clarity of a bell cutting through mist. If I disappear here, would anyone notice? No answer. The wind howled beyond the walls like a distant, desperate moan. The cabin seemed to shrink around him, the space unchanged, but his mind collapsing inward. Evan sank to the floor, clutched the notebook, not to write, but as if holding the last piece of proof that he had ever been. The only thing still warm was the paper, and even that, too, would cool. He didn't know how long he'd sat by the door. The light outside hadn't changed, still blinding white, endless. Inside, the fire had begun to die. The wood was nearly gone. Evan stood, crossed the room, gathered the last few scattered logs, and placed them into the fireplace. The flames flared up again, but they didn't feel warm, and he wasn't sure he wanted warmth anymore. His body was tired, but his mind, it was more exhausted than it had ever been. A strange feeling had begun to stir inside him. Not fear of dying, but fear of surviving and having to return to his old life. What would happen if he was rescued? Go back to the city? Open his laptop again? Sit through more online meetings where no one truly listened? Rewrite his resume? Smile in interviews where people decided his worth based on 2 lines of experience? Or worse, live like this never happened? He found himself wondering, had anything in his life ever truly been real? His mind felt scrambled, not from hunger, not from cold, but from a collapse of everything he used to believe made him, like an old wall, soaked and crumbling from the inside, needing no hammer to fall. For years, he'd lived as though life were a temporary draft. The job? For now. The relationship? Good enough. The dream? Once, maybe. Evan walked to the wooden table, opened his notebook. He began to write. His hands still trembled, but not from fear, from the force of the words ripping their way out. I've lived like I could fix everything later, but then I realized, later never comes if I don't start living honestly now. He wrote another sentence, then another, not to share with anyone, but because if he stopped, he wasn't sure he'd remember how to breathe. And in this cold cabin, it wasn't the freezing that scared him. It was the thought of vanishing without a trace, like an unsent email, like a draft that never got posted, like a sketch hidden in a drawer, never shown, never named. Then an image flashed in his mind, not of anyone else, but of himself at 13, sitting on his bedroom floor, holding a red-colored pencil, drawing a face with tears. Sunlight pouring through the window. The boy tilting his head, focused, completely absorbed, like he was drawing his own soul and didn't know it. You were there, and I was the first person who left you. The words didn't make a sound, but they echoed, clear and undeniable, through Evan's mind, as if the boy he once was had just stepped into the cabin and quietly taken a seat beside him. Evan lifted his head, looked into the empty air, then whispered, "I'm sorry." The tears came again. Not dramatic, not tragic, just real, like a single drop of water filling a glass that had been forgotten on a shelf for years. He clutched the notebook to his chest, held it close, like holding onto the fragment of a soul he thought he'd lost, a part of himself he used to be, a part that never truly died, just locked away in all the years he'd spent pretending to be a grown-up. He stayed there for a long time, didn't write, didn't think, just breathed. For the first time in years, he breathed like someone who actually wanted to live. As the last flame in the fireplace flickered out, darkness slowly crept back into the cabin. But this time, Evan didn't jump up to look for more firewood. No rush, no calculations. He just sat there, back against the wall, hands resting at his sides, eyes open in the cold night and silent. It wasn't the silence that scared him anymore. It was the realization that he used to be afraid of it. Isolation no longer felt like a trap. It was just a mirror, and for years, Evan had avoided looking into it. He used to believe that if he stayed busy enough, smart enough, validated enough, he wouldn't need to ask questions. But the truth was, no amount of applause from the outside could fill a room that was hollow on the inside. He closed his eyes. His back touched the cold wooden wall. But something inside no longer shrank away. A softness had opened up, small, but enough. Enough to hold the pieces he once discarded. His vulnerability, his sadness, his longing, and a quiet, unspoken desire to live without having to justify it. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe no one would find him. Maybe someone would. But for the first time, that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was a quiet truth he had finally uncovered, after 3 days surrounded by snow. I don't need anyone to rescue me anymore, because I've stopped running. For days later, when the search team finally reached the old cabin, flurries of snow were still falling. They hadn't expected much. The wind had been brutal, the conditions unforgiving. No one truly believed someone could survive out there without supplies. But when they stepped inside, they found Evan sitting quietly in front of a cold fireplace, his face turned slightly toward the pale light coming through the small window. He opened his eyes at the sound of their boots crunching on the floor, but he didn't look startled. He didn't rush to his feet. He simply looked at them with a calm, almost weightless gaze, as if it already accepted both possibilities, being found or not. The first approach was a young rescue worker. He called Evan's name. Evan nodded. No urgency, no joy, just a slow, grounded response of someone who had walked out of another world, and now simply needed a moment to match the rhythm of this one. He rose, didn't explain, didn't ask anything, didn't cry. Outside, people bombarded him with questions. He couldn't recall most of them. What he did remember was this. When he stepped out of that cabin, he didn't feel like someone who had been rescued. He felt like someone who had finally stopped killing himself with the weight of the roles he played every day. 3 weeks later, Evan returned to the city. Same apartment, same streets he once loathed. But everything felt different, not because the city had changed, but because he no longer mirrored himself in it the same way. He ate more slowly, didn't play music in the shower, didn't panic when the Wi-Fi dropped out. And one afternoon, he bought a box of colored pencils. He placed it on his desk, didn't touch it. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of it being there. 9 months later, Evan disappeared from social media. No new posts, no job updates. No one knew exactly where he was. Those who had once known him would occasionally let his name drift through faded memories and then move on. Until one day, an art student posted a photo on a forum, a painting with no known artist. It showed a small cabin deep in the snowy woods. Inside, a man sat by the fireplace, hugging a notebook. The firelight cast a soft glow on his face, blurred yet full of emotion. The scene was framed as if the viewer stood outside, peering in through a window. The caption read, "I found this sketch in an old cafe in Vermont. No signature, but I think someone once truly lived inside it." The post went viral, thousands of shares. Some said it was painted by a reclusive artist. Others claimed they had seen the man in a quiet forest-side town, buying coffee and sketch pads every morning. But no one had a photo. No one had an address. Only stories. Years passed, and tales of the man who vanished after a snowstorm were still told now and then, like a modern-day legend. Some believed, some laughed, but somewhere in a distant cabin, far from the city, a fire still crackled each night, and a man still drew the things he had once forgotten. Not to display, not to sell, just to say, "I was here, I lived." Perhaps the most haunting part of Evan's story wasn't the cold. It wasn't the fear of being left alone in the deep woods. It was a question no one heard. If I disappeared, would anyone notice? A simple question on the surface, but it struck at the silent emptiness that so many carry in today's world. A world where we're constantly connected, endlessly updated, and yet drifting further and further away from ourselves. Evan wasn't swallowed by a snowstorm. What truly consumed him was a silence inside, a silence he had buried for years. This story isn't a survival guide. It doesn't teach you how to live in the wild. It's not about enduring nature. It's about stopping the escape. We rush through life so fast. We lose pieces of ourselves without even noticing. And when Evan was trapped, the first thing he had to face wasn't death. It was the self he had long abandoned. No one came to save him with an inspiring speech. There were no miracles, no Hollywood plot twist. Only a man, finally still, finally brave enough to feel the pain, to write down the truth, to stay. And something strange happens when we stop fighting so hard. In surrender, we finally touch life. So, if you're somewhere out there, in a crowded city, tired, feeling like you're slowly fading, maybe Evan's story is a quiet whisper meant for you. You don't have to be stronger. You just have to stay long enough to hear your own voice. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment, a sentence, a single, or just the words, "I understand." Your presence is the reason we continue telling stories like this. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next videos. Your support means the world to us. It's what keeps us going, sharing these raw, human slices of life. We'll see you again in the next story.